Everybody thinks they know how the Soviet Union died. Reagan stared them down, right? Star Wars: The Arms Race. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. The West won because freedom triumphs over tyranny, because democracy beats communism, because good guys finish first. That's the story they sell you. That's the Hollywood ending, but it's a lie. A comfortable lie that lets us sleep at night believing the world works the way we want it to. The Soviet Union didn't lose a war. They didn't get invaded. No enemy tanks rolled through Red Square. The USSR died the way most empires die, choking on their own debt, drowning in bills they couldn't pay, brought to their knees by numbers on a balance sheet. This is the story of how a superpower with thousands of nuclear weapons, millions of soldiers, and an empire spanning 11 time zones went bankrupt. And the terrifying part? The same thing could happen to any empire, including ours, December 26, 1991. The Soviet flag came down from the Kremlin for the last time. 74 years of communist rule, finished, the Cold War, over. And everyone in the West celebrated like we'd won some great military victory. But here's what they don't show you in the celebration footage. The reason that flag came down had nothing to do with ideology or military might. It came down because the Soviet Union was broke. Completely, utterly, catastrophically broke. The grocery stores had been empty for years. The currency was worthless. The government couldn't pay its workers. Pensions evaporated. The entire economic system had collapsed from the inside, like a building with termites eating the foundation, while everyone was too busy looking at the pretty facade. You want to know when the Soviet Union actually started dying? Not 1991, not when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The death blow came earlier. 1986. That's the year everything broke. And it wasn't a military defeat that did it, it was oil prices. Let me explain how this works, because this is the part they don't teach you in history class. By the 1970s, the Soviet economy was running on one thing: oil. That's it. Not innovation, not manufacturing, not agriculture, oil. The USSR was sitting on some of the largest oil reserves on the planet. And when oil prices skyrocketed during the 1973 oil crisis, Soviet leadership thought they'd hit the jackpot. Money flooded in, petrodollars, the kind of wealth that makes you stupid, makes you lazy, makes you think you're invincible. Instead of fixing the broken Soviet economic system, they used oil money to paper over the cracks. Food shortages? Buy grain from America with oil money? Factories producing garbage nobody wants? Who cares? We've got oil money. An arms race with the United States draining the budget? Print more money? We've got oil. But here's the thing about building your entire economy on a single commodity. You're not in control anymore. The market is, and in the 1980s, the market turned into a weapon. In 1980, oil was selling for about $35 a barrel. By 1986, it had crashed to under $10. The Soviet economy, dependent on those oil exports, lost roughly 2/3 of its revenue almost overnight. 2/3. Imagine if your salary got cut by 70% tomorrow, and you still had to pay all your bills. That's what happened to the Soviet Union. And those bills were massive. This is where things get ugly. Because while oil prices were collapsing, the Soviet Union was hemorrhaging money on two catastrophic fronts. First, Afghanistan. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, thinking it would be a quick operation to prop up a friendly communist government. Instead, it became their Vietnam, a brutal, endless, unwinnable war that dragged on for a decade. Every day, Soviet helicopters burned fuel, soldiers consumed supplies, weapons got expended, and body bags came home. The Afghan war was bleeding the Soviet treasury dry. Billions of rubles poured into that desert nightmare, and what did they get in return? Dead soldiers, international condemnation, and a generation of Soviet citizens asking why their kids were dying for nothing. Second front, the arms race with the United States. Reagan wasn't just talking tough, he was spending ungodly amounts of money on military technology, missile systems, bomber aircraft, and yes, the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars. Was Star Wars realistic? Didn't matter. The Soviets thought it might be, and that meant they had to match it. Every dollar America spent on defense, the Soviet Union tried to match. But here's the critical difference. America could afford it. The United States had a functioning economy, innovation, global trade networks, access to international credit markets. The Soviet Union had oil and a command economy that was collapsing under its own inefficiency. On paper, the Soviet economy looked impressive. Factories everywhere, full employment, production quotas being met, but it was all smoke and mirrors. Soviet factories were producing things nobody wanted, using outdated technology, wasting resources at obscene rates. A Soviet factory manager got rewarded for meeting production targets, not for making things people actually needed. So you'd have a nail factory that got bonuses for producing tons of nails, literally, measured by weight. Know what they did? Made giant, useless nails, heavy ones. Met their quota, got their bonus, and nobody had the small nails they actually needed. That was the Soviet economy in miniature, absurd, inefficient, broken at a fundamental level. But when oil prices were high, they could hide all of this. Import what they needed, buy off the population with cheap bread and guaranteed jobs, maintain the military, keep the satellites in line. When oil prices crashed, the whole illusion shattered. And then, just to make everything worse, Chernobyl happened. April 1986. A nuclear reactor exploded, spewing radiation across Europe. The cleanup cost? Estimates suggest it consumed roughly 18 billion rubles, maybe more. Nobody knows the real number because the Soviets tried to hide it. But that money had to come from somewhere, and somewhere was already empty. If you're still watching this, hit that subscribe button because what comes next is how the Soviet government made everything infinitely worse, and there's a lesson in here that applies to every empire that's ever existed. When the Soviet Union realized they were running out of money, they did what every desperate government does: they borrowed. Soviet planners went to Western banks, hat in hand asking for loans, and Western banks, seeing an opportunity, loaned them billions. Why not? The Soviet Union was a superpower. Too big to fail, right? Surely they'd figure it out. Except they didn't figure it out. They used the borrowed money to keep the charade going a little longer, to buy food from abroad because Soviet agriculture was a disaster, to maintain military spending they couldn't afford, to keep the empire from flying apart. But debt has a funny feature. It comes due with interest. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was trapped in a debt spiral. Borrowing to pay old debts. Borrowing to buy basic necessities. The ruble was becoming worthless. Inflation was creeping up, and the Soviet people, they were starting to notice. Store shelves were empty, not sometimes, constantly. Grocery stores with nothing but vinegar and canned fish. Bread lines stretching around blocks. People hoarding toilet paper, soap, anything they could find because tomorrow it might not be available at all. Ration coupons made a comeback, like it was World War II again. And here's the part that should terrify you. The Soviet government had no idea how to fix it. The communist command economy wasn't designed to be flexible. It couldn't pivot, couldn't adapt, couldn't innovate. Everything ran on 5-year plans and centralized control. When the center stopped working, the whole system froze. Gorbachev tried reforms, perestroika, glasnost, all the buzzwords you learned in school. But reforms can't fix an economy that's fundamentally broken. You can't restructure your way out of bankruptcy when you don't have money and you can't produce anything the world wants to buy. Meanwhile, the Soviet Empire was fracturing. The satellite states in Eastern Europe could smell the weakness. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, they'd been held in place by Soviet military might and economic subsidies. When the subsidies dried up and the military threat became hollow, they started pulling away. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, not because of some military defeat, but because the Soviet Union couldn't afford to hold it anymore. East Germany was propped up by Soviet money. No money, no East Germany, simple math. But the real nightmare was happening inside the Soviet Union itself. The 15 republics that made up the USSR were held together by a combination of communist ideology, centralized economic control, and the implicit threat of force. When the economy collapsed, the ideology became a joke. Nobody believed in the communist future anymore when they couldn't feed their kids today. The central government in Moscow tried to hold everything together, but they were paying with worthless rubles and empty promises. The republics started declaring independence. First the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, then others. The empire was disintegrating. And throughout all of this, there's a darker story lurking underneath. Some historians believe the oil price collapse wasn't entirely accidental. There are credible theories that the United States worked with Saudi Arabia to flood the market with oil, deliberately driving down prices to strangle the Soviet economy. The Saudis had the capacity to increase production. America had the diplomatic leverage. And both had motivation to see the Soviet Union weakened. Was it a coordinated economic warfare campaign? The evidence is murky, deliberately so. But the timing is awfully convenient. Oil prices crashed right when the Soviet Union was most vulnerable, accelerating a collapse that might have taken decades otherwise. This is how empires actually die in the modern world. Not with a bang, but with a bankruptcy filing. Economic warfare is cleaner than real war. No bombers, no invasions, no body bags on the evening news. Just numbers on a spreadsheet, commodity prices adjusting, interest rates shifting. And somewhere, millions of people who did nothing wrong watched their savings evaporate, their pensions disappear, their futures crumble. The Soviet Union had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world several times over, but they couldn't pay for bread. They had millions of soldiers, but couldn't pay their salaries. They had an empire, but couldn't maintain it. By 1991, the Soviet government was bankrupt in every sense of the word. Financially bankrupt, unable to pay debts, unable to fund basic services. Politically bankrupt. Nobody believed in the system anymore. Morally bankrupt, the promise of communist prosperity revealed as a cruel joke. In August 1991, hardliners attempted a coup to restore order, to bring back the Iron Fist. It failed within days because nobody cared. The military wouldn't fully back it, the people ignored it, and the economy was too far gone for a coup to matter. You can seize power, but you can't seize money that doesn't exist. On December 25th, 1991, Gorbachev resigned. The next day, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. Not because NATO invaded, not because capitalism won a debate. Because the checks bounced, the empire ran out of money and credit, and when that happens, everything else is just theater. The Soviet people paid the price, like they always do. The 1990s in Russia were apocalyptic. Life expectancy dropped, savings wiped out by hyperinflation. Organized crime filled the vacuum left by collapsed government authority. State assets got privatized in crooked deals that created a new class of oligarchs overnight. Pensioners who worked their whole lives found their pensions worthless. The social safety net, healthcare, education, housing, collapsed along with everything else. This is what bankruptcy looks like at the scale of a superpower. Millions of lives destroyed not by bombs, but by balance sheets. And here's the lesson that nobody wants to hear. This can happen to any empire, right now. The United States is carrying debt levels that would have been unimaginable a generation ago. China is building an economy on real estate speculation and unsustainable growth. The European Union is held together by economic arrangements that strain under pressure. Every empire thinks it's different, thinks it's special, thinks it's immune to the laws of economics. The Soviets thought that too. They had nuclear weapons, a massive military, educated population, natural resources. And it didn't matter. When the money runs out, everything else is just decoration. The Soviet flag came down in 1991. We told ourselves a story about how we won, how freedom conquered tyranny, how the good guys prevailed. But the real story is colder and more instructive. The Soviet Union died because empires are expensive, because wars in places like Afghanistan drain treasuries, because arms races are unsustainable, because dependence on commodity exports is a trap, because debt eventually comes due, because when people can't eat, they stop caring about ideology. We didn't defeat the Soviet Union, we outspent them. We used economic tools to strangle them. We waited while they bankrupted themselves, trying to keep up. And then we watched them collapse under the weight of their own bills. That's not a victory of ideas, that's accounting. That's the cold math of empire, where nations rise and fall based on balance sheets and interest rates and commodity prices. The Soviet Union fell the way most empires fall, not to a foreign army, but to their own contradictions, their own debts, their own inability to pay for the system they built. And somewhere, right now, another empire is making the same mistakes, running up the same bills, assuming it'll never happen to them. History doesn't repeat, but it sure as hell rhymes. And when the next superpower finds itself unable to pay its debts, when the store shelves empty and the currency collapses, remember, we've seen this before, December 1991, the day a nuclear superpower died of bankruptcy. Sleep tight.